Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. Today I'm going to be talking about chapter 7, proposing a solution, and this will also be your second essay, right? For your second essay, you'll be proposing a solution. In the first essay, you took a position and you defended that position, and now you will be offering um, a solution, right? Um, and you have a couple of options for the second essay. You can come up with a completely different topic, right? And frame your solution through that topic. Or you could also use your first essay, right? Use the position from your first essay and develop that into a solution, right? And then you would then build from that how you're going uh, to actualize, right, that solution. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the video. So today we'll just turn to the notes that I've provided for you, as always. And so, yeah, we'll just jump right into it. On the first page of chapter 7, here are some questions, right, that they're posing that's related to the sample essays also in this chapter, right? So I'm just going to read the first quotations. Can a student convince his professor that giving frequent, low-stakes exams is a good idea, right? Can an education professor persuade school boards to push back high school start times? Would a national student exchange program help bridge the political and cultural divide? Could a tax on soda pop help reduce obesity? Right. So these are the questions that the essays examples in this chapter are posing. Right. So these are the problems, and these are also the sort of like solutions that they're offering in this chapter. Right. And so we'll talk more about that as we go through this entire chapter. So I guess one way of thinking about this essay is to think about, especially presidential elections is coming up, right? And there's a lot of campaigning going on. If you watch the news, if you're not watching the news, I can't blame you because the news is a bit polarizing, right, to say the least. But if you've noticed, right, people are campaigning. There's a big election in November, right, presidential and also smaller positions. And so a lot of people are campaigning, and part of the campaign, right, um, is really these politicians kind of offering solutions to a lot of problems in our societies, or in our society, right? And so, yeah, if you're paying attention to these politicians, they are pretty much talking about problems and then they are sort of proposing solutions. Now, whether that solution gets realized or not, that's another issue. But what they're doing, right, is giving us solutions, right? And sometimes they're false hopes, but they're sort of they're you can kind of look at them, right, as a model for how to think about proposing a solution, right? Um, right. So when you start thinking about a problem, right? Because ultimately, if there's a solution that you're trying to propose, there has to be a problem, right? Um, and so when you start thinking about a solution, start by thinking about it kind of idealistically, right? sort of like what is the sort of larger or what is the perfect, I guess, right? What is the perfect situation that you want to happen, right? Um, as a solution to a problem, right? Um, but then obviously that perfect solution is not oftentimes might not be realistic, right? And so you want to start sort of like big, start sort of idealistically, um, but then you want to kind of winnow it down, right, to a more sort of like realistic set of solutions, right, or to a more realistic solution, right, and having more sort of like realistic steps on achieving this solution, right, because obviously there's a lot of factors involved in making a solution happen, right? There's political issues. There's sort of like people just don't care, or funding, lack of funding, right? Money is one of the biggest issues, right? That makes solutions very difficult because there's no money to implement certain solutions, right? Um, there's not enough sort of people caring, and so it doesn't get sort of like pushed into sort of political arenas, and so politicians don't fund it. And so yeah, so there's a lot of factors, right, that needs to be considered when proposing a solution, and you have to be aware of these factors, right? And in order for your solution to be realistically implemented, right, you have to address these factors, right? How are you going to fund it, right? What are the time frame? What is the time frame involved, right, in accomplishing the solution, right? Who needs to be involved in this? Do we need to contact politicians? Do we need to contact scientists? Right. So you need to sort of like consider all the factors and make sure you can address, right, all of these sort of factors, and how you will sort of like implement your plan, right? Um, okay, so we'll start by talking about the purpose of the essay, right? So the first purpose is to convince readers that a problem exists, right? Like I said, uh, the reason why we need solutions is because there's a problem. So you have to identify a problem first, right? And I guess like the first thing that comes to mind because of the political climate, right? Um, the problem of capitalism, for example, right? America is a capitalist country, and so a lot of politicians, especially in the left, right, are criticizing capitalism, criticizing how sort of unfair and unequal the distribution um, of money, right, in this country, because of capitalism. Certain number, very small number of people are billionaires, but then a lot of people are sort of suffering and very poor and starving, right? So this sort of like vast disparity, economic disparity, right, is something that a lot of politicians are trying to address, right? And so they've identified the problem in capitalism, right? This idea that we can just consume and exploit resources and exploit sort of other people, right? As long as we make money, right? Um, that sort of idea is that concept, that aspect of capitalism, right, is very much the subject of debate, right, as a problem for America. Um, and so yeah, and so you want to identify the problem, right? And you need to be able to um, understand, right, how the problem sort of came about, um, and what are the factors, right, leading to this problem. So you want to like read about, the history of whatever sort of problem that you're trying to address, right? And so the second purpose is to inspire readers to take action by stressing the problem's urgency, right, or seriousness, right? Um, right. So in order for you to be convincing to your readers, you want to make it clear to them that this problem needs to be addressed and a solution needs to happen because there's a lot at stake, right? And again, to go back to capitalism, right? You can sort of identify not only the fact that there's more there's a very small number of billionaires, and then there's like a lot of like working class people, right? Um, not just that aspect of the problem, right? But the sort of desperate and sort of like homelessness, for example, right? People sort of like dying because they can't afford, you know, um, medication, right? Or they don't have health care, right? And so there's very sort of like you want to point out like sort of what are the immediate consequences, right? What's actually happening now that that's a consequence of the problem, right? That would make uh, putting forward a solution very important, right? And very urgent. And why is it important to propose the solution now, right? Why can't it wait for another 10 years or 20 years, right? So in this case, you want to say, people are dying, um, and so, we can't just sort of postpone that, right? Because the more we postpone it, the more people are going to die, right? So you want to make it clear to the readers, right, that this sort of solution is very urgent, right? Um, so the third purpose is to persuade readers that the writer's proposed solution is feasible and can be implemented, right? Like I also mentioned, you want to part of your essay will be to break down, right, how realistic your solution is going to be, right? Um, and you want to really consider a lot of factors, right? Economic factors, sort of strategic factors, right? Issue of timing, right? You want to like know how you're going to approach the solution and make it right as realistic or can be achieved realistically, right, as possible. Right. So the fourth purpose is to confirm the writer's refutation of objections and alternative solutions, right? So here, just like the first essay, you will still need to acknowledge opposing viewpoints, right? And sort of objections about your solution, right? You have to acknowledge them, but you need to also rebut them, right? And say, yes, this is a realistic objection, but here's how I can address that, right? Or here's why it's wrong, right? And so to go back again, right, with the issue of capitalism. So for capitalism, a lot of politicians are suggesting the solution would be sort of socialism, right? Which means a sort of a more equal, not completely equal, right, but a more equal distribution of wealth, right, in the country, right, so that like you know, 5% of the population are filthy wealthy, right? And then everyone else is just barely surviving, right? Um, and so the proposal, right, the solution that a lot of politicians are putting forward, right, is sort of a more sort of socialist approach on government, right? Um, and so universal health care, right? Low or even free uh, uh, college education, right? Um, and there's a lot of stuff, right? Raise in minimum wage, um, right? So these are sort of possible objections, right? And even sort of the objections, right? That having universal healthcare is just too expensive. We just can't afford it. It's going to cost us, you know, uh, tens of trillions of dollars, right? Um, so these are the objections for the solution of socialism, right? And so, if, for example, your solution socialism, right, you would want to acknowledge these objections, right? But then you would address it by saying, yeah, this costs, $10 trillion in the long run, but or right, the fact like a lot of one of the major objections is that it's going to increase taxes for everyone, right? If we did a universal healthcare, and so the way that you would approach that is to say yes, taxes will be increased, but if you look at it in the long run, right, people will actually save more money and also um, have more health benefits, right? Than um, if we continue with the current system, right? And so you still want to acknowledge objections and then address it, right? Just the same as the first one, the first essay. All right. So now we're going to go through the basic features of this essay, right? So the basic features are pretty much similar to the first essay, but there's a little difference in strategies, right? Since we are proposing a solution and not just arguing a position, right? Um, So the first basic feature is a focused and well-defined problem, right? And so, like I said, you want to make sure you're identifying the problem, and then you want to historicize the problem, right? Or you want to contextualize the problem, right? And so you want to identify how did this problem sort of how did it came about, right? And then what are the structures of this problem, right? Like what sort of like led it, what factors led it into becoming what it is now as a problem, right? Um, and so by tracing that history, that context of the problem, right, then you will be better equipped at addressing right the problem with your solution, right. So if you know what sort of constitutes the problem, it's A, B, C, right, that caused the problem, and so the way that you're going to address it, right, is also by approaching the very sort of structures, right? So A is the problem, and so here's my solution to A, right? B is the second problem, so here's my solution to B, right? C is the third problem, and then here's my solution to C, right? And so it's only by knowing the structures of your problem that you'll be able to address them sort of that you'll be able to address it, right? Specifically, right? And then again, a well-argued position or solution, right, has a thesis. So the same thing, the thesis will be in the first or in the last sentence of your last sentence or last two sentences of your introduction, right? So the same as the first essay. And so typically the thesis, right, would describe the proposed solution, right? But you also want to mention the problem in the thesis, right? So for your thesis, you should mention the problem and then mention sort of like how you're addressing the problem, right? What your solution is, right? So those two things, right, should be included in your thesis, right? A summary of the problem and a summary of the solution. So let's look at an example here on the first essay example by O'Malley. Right. So I will read the thesis here. Right. Quote. So not only do high stakes exams discourage frequent study and undermine students' performance, they also do long-term damage to students' cognitive development, right? If professors gave brief exams at frequent intervals, students would be spurred to learn more and worry less, right? They would study more regularly, perform better on tests, and enhance their cognitive functioning, right? So what is this? So that's 3 sentences, right? For O'Malley's thesis, right? So that's perfectly fine. Your thesis can be 1, 2, or 3. I think I would limit it to 3 sentences for the thesis, right? So, okay, so let's look at O'Malley's thesis here. So it's exactly right. So high stakes exams discourage frequent study and undermine students' performance. They also do long-term damage to students' cognitive development, right? So that's the problem, right? The problem is professors pushing students too much and giving them too much work, right? At smaller amounts of time, right? Or having kind of like big exams, right? And so that's the problem, right, in the first sentence. And then the second sentence, if professors gave brief exams at frequent intervals, right? So that's his solution, right? So the problem is fewer and more intense exams are not productive, right? So the solution would be more exams more frequently, right? So smaller exams, but more frequent, right? Instead of fewer exams, that's intense, right? So if professors gave brief exams of frequent intervals, students would be spurred to learn more and worry less, right? They would study more regularly, perform better, and enhance their cognitive functioning, right? And so he's arguing that this solution will not just make the students more productive, right? In terms of, or will not only make the students perform better academically, but they will actually be helpful for their sort of psychological well-being, right? So that's a good example, right, of a thesis. So a well-argued solution should also use argumentative tactics, right, such as cause and effect, comparison, and process analysis, right? And so we'll look at some examples here, right? So throughout your essay, um, as you're sort of proposing the solution, right? You want to use these tactics, right? Of cause and effect, comparison, and process analysis, right? So comparison just really means, for example, solution X has worked for problem Y, right? So it could work for whatever as well, right? So just uh, identifying kind of like parallels, right? So your solution, like how can you what other solutions can you compare your own solution to, right? And say this solution worked, so I think my solution will also work, right? So that's through comparison, right? Um, and then there's also cause and effect, right? And so instead of comparison, um, you'll kind of identify the process, right? By saying, as research show, right, solution X would stop blah blah blah, change blah blah blah, reverse blah blah blah, and would lead to, right, um, X, Y, and Z, right? So you'll sort of like identify um, what sort of like what steps, right, are necessary to achieving your um, the realization of your solution, right? So you want to use comparison, you want to use cause and effect, um, and you also want to use process analysis, right? Um, and so this is just sort of describing sort of like the steps, right? That needs to be done in order for your solution to be realized, right? How much money does it need? How much time does it need? Who needs to be approached, right? So you want to sort of like describe the process, right, in order to achieve your solution. Okay. And then another part of a well-argued solution, right, as I already mentioned, is to acknowledge objections, right, and argue that your proposal is better, right, pretty much, or concede, right, by saying that the objection is not sort of what your solution is addressing, right, or perhaps that um, the objection is asking the wrong question, right? Um, so to go back to the example of socialism, right, and increase in taxes, right, and so the possible objection to socialism or socialist system, right, would be that people are saying, oh, like don't believe in that because that's only gonna cost you more in taxes, right? And so you would concede, right, by saying that that's actually not a productive objection. That's not a good objection because it overlooks the fact that long term, even though you're paying more every year, that in taxes, right, you're actually also saving in other sort of um, in other aspects, right? So you're paying more in taxes, but you're not paying for any kind of insurance, right? So you save with that, or you go to a doctor and you don't pay a copay, right? Or you go to the pharmacy and you don't pay a copay, right? And then medications would be cheaper, for example, right? And so there are a lot of things, right, that you will be able that you are not um, that where you will save money, right? Even though you are paying more taxes, right? And so your argument would be to say, yes, you're paying more taxes, but you're actually saving more in other aspects, right? And then eventually you are actually saving more um, through universal health care, right? For example. Um, And so, right, so that would be that would be part of a well argued solution, right? Is to acknowledge objections. So the last basic feature for this essay, right, the same as the first essay, is a clear and logical organization, right? And that only means that you know, you should be using transitions, right, and cueing the reader, right, in order to make your argument and your solution clear, right? And so here, if you look at that section on in chapter 7, that section on a clear and logical organization, right? So you should be using, just like the first essay, you should be using transitions. You should be cueing your reader, right? Using conjunctions. Right. So like just go through this section. There's not much in this section because it's already included in the other chapter also. And so that should be something that you're already doing, right? Make sure your paragraphs are well divided, right? Make sure you're sort of the same as the first essay. You're going to propose a solution, like in one paragraph, for example, right? You're gonna want to propose a solution and then provide an example, right? And then propose a solution and provide an example, right? Right. So I think that's it for now for this chapter. But I'm going to post another video, sort of talking about the example essays, right, in this chapter. I think I will post that on Monday, end of Monday. So I'll have 2 videos next week, right? There will be 2 short videos. So one video will be on the examples from chapter 7, and then the other video will be on the readings. So I will be sending you a new syllabus, a new revised syllabus, and there are 2 articles that I want you to read. And I will also send you the PDF for those articles. And so I will be, the other video will be about those articles, right? So that's for next week. Right, so for now, just read the examples and figure out if you, or try to start brainstorming possible topics and possible problems that you want to address, right? Or figure out if you just want to use your first essay, right, and develop that into a solution, right? So if you want to do that, if you want to use the first essay and develop that into a solution, here's a little example, right? So for example, right, if your position in the first essay was, it's not the money that makes people happy, right? It's how they spend it and on what, right? So that's one of your classmates' position in the first essay, right? That it's not the money that makes people happy, it's how they spend it, right? And on what, right? And so the possible way that you can develop that into a solution would be to say, that you would propose a lifestyle of downsizing, right? By demystifying ideas of living large, right? So that would be your solution, right? Downsizing, right, would be your solution. That would be your way of developing how spending money, or how spending money wisely, right, is actually what leads to happiness and not just having money, right? Um, and so you would talk about, so the problem would be, right, um, this idea of this American idea of living large, right? This idea that we have to have like sort of big houses, right? That we have to have sort of, you know, all these things in our house, right? To fill the house, right? That we have to have sort of, you know, like Big Macs, and everything is big and everything is large and everything is sort of, you know, extreme, right? So this idea of living large, right, is in conjunction with capitalism, which is all about consumption, right? So the more you buy, the more you feed capitalism, because you know you're you're consuming. That means you're paying, right? Um, and so a possible way of uh, providing a solution for that is to say, you know, why not just consider the fact of, you know, downsizing, right? Be happy with a smaller house, even though, you know, even though it's a small house, you have everything that you need, right? Or right, or just kind of doing everything instead of, you know, big size, or what do you call that? Like oversize everything, right? Just consider, you know, buying uh, enough, right? Um, I guess like the lesson in this pandemic would be, right, the shortage of, of toilet papers, right? Because you know the pandemic has sort of threatened, right, this American idea of being able to possess, right, a lot of toilet paper, that they just, you know, they went crazy and bought everything that they could see, right? And so, right, that mentality of, you know, of consuming, of like being able to like just take everything, could actually be quite harmful, right? And so, right, so this idea of downsizing, of being okay with not having too much, or being okay with just having enough, right, would be one way to address a solution, right, or to propose a solution to um, this idea that money, right, doesn't make you happy, but it's how you spend it, right. So that's just an example that you know, you could kind of like consider. Um, so start thinking about that. Start thinking about topics, and right. And I will see you in the next video.